Hello, everyone. In the interest of time, I will be very brief and see if we have a little bit of time for some of the people that participated in these language access cafes to give a little bit of an update. So, our topic was the educational setting and interpreting crossroads. And we really had the goal of going over some of these areas of overlap between healthcare interpreting and education, really deciphering what some of these challenges, differences, and similarities are, and then identifying the resources and tools that would help healthcare interpreters succeed in these settings. So, the first thing that we did was to establish whether or not there were any educational settings where healthcare interpreting knowledge and skills was not applicable. And I think we kind of came to a consensus, although the notes here may not seem like it is. And I think the consensus is that any educational setting could include healthcare knowledge and skills, or at any educational setting, healthcare interpreting knowledge and skills may be useful. However, there is so much more, and there are a lot of differences in educational settings, different terminology, role boundaries being a little bit more blurred and different, that healthcare interpreting knowledge and skills alone are not going to be enough. So we went on to talk about the specific settings that we could identify in education where there may be some of that crossroads. You can see them all here next to my picture on my image. Doing a picture in picture inlay through broadcasted through my camera so that you all can see everything. But it's pretty much everything that we could think of. There's a lot of them. Something that I found very interesting is that a lot of times when we think about interpreters in the classroom, we think about sign language interpreters, but there are some opportunities for spoken language interpreters to also be in the classroom, specifically in support of some immigrant students, mostly in the middle to high school level, who are getting some of that additional support in their language to be able to integrate into the general education classroom and learn the language, the English language, while they continue to learn the academic principles that they need to learn. Now, something that was also interesting is that there are some hospitals that have classrooms incorporated in there, especially for children receiving long-term care. So we even see the education coming into the healthcare in hospitals in those classrooms. So I don't know how many of you out there have experienced that. Maybe the person that shared this in our Language Access Cafe may want to talk a little bit more about it if we have time. But moving right along, we also discussed some of these similarities, and you can see all of the similarities here. I think a lot of the interpreting skills required the managing flow, the knowing how to intervene. Cultural competence was a big one, and I have to say that we only had two groups yesterday talk about this, but they both mentioned cultural competence. We actually had Iris and Gupta in one of our groups, and she really gave us a lot of very vivid and very good examples about the importance of cultural competence and the interpreter's role in being able to facilitate that both in healthcare and in education. Again, these are some of those similarities. We did discuss some of the differences, and I think we all agree that the setting is going to be different. Sometimes some of the participants and their level of knowledge and skills are going to be different. I think overall we both agreed that the goals of the encounter are going to be different. In healthcare, you're focusing on treating an illness or recovery or something to that effect, while in the educational setting, you're usually focusing on academic progress and the learning plan and really focusing on the knowledge that the student's able to acquire. I'm speaking very fast and I apologize. I'm just trying to get as much out and leave as much time as possible for everybody else. I think we also established again that there's some role boundaries that are going to be different, especially for those interpreters that are going to be working in the classroom. And just being in the classroom gives the interpreter a different relationship with the student. There's a lot more repeated exposure to the students. Relationships can form a little bit more. There's more of that expectation for there to be a relationship, a trust between the student and the interpreter. And sometimes the interpreter may be asked to kind of move into that helper role for the educational benefit of the student. And I think it kind of goes back to that goal. The goals are different, and the person that's able to provide and help the student meet that goal might be different. Now, you may disagree, but this is just kind of some of the discussion that we had. There's a lot more to be discussed, obviously. We talked about the code of ethics, and here it seems as though we disagree a little bit, but I really think that the groups did come to a consensus, because I think that what we agreed on is that yes, all of the tenets in the Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice that NCIHC has developed would apply to education, they apply to healthcare, and we were able to argue that they apply to any setting, really, where there is interpreting. But we felt that it wasn't enough, and that is something that one of the groups really focused on discussing, that it's not enough for healthcare interpreters, and it really wouldn't be enough in guiding educational interpreters or interpreters in educational settings. Not only that, but there are some specific differences between the settings that would need to be addressed so that people have a little bit more guidance. So, in wrapping up, what are some of those resources and tools that educational interpreters would need, or interpreters that are healthcare interpreters in educational settings might need? Well, of course, they'll need to be exposed to some of that specialized terminology, and there were some suggestions for specific resources that can help. And it's not just the terminology that's specific to education that's important, but also some of that contextual knowledge, understanding the educational system, not just in the United States, but also those in other countries, to make sure that there's an understanding, and then that these two things can really be bridged through the interpretation. A lot of other suggestions here, understanding some of the history, and of course, laws that are very specific to education. Some of the ones mentioned are up on the board, but of course, not only is HIPAA important, but now you also have FERPA, you have IDEA, you have 94142, and there's just a lot of many other things. Something that was also mentioned that we all felt could be applied to any setting, but because this is the setting that we were discussing, we applied it here. And that's that it's important for interpreters to know how to start, carry out, and end sessions. And that's something that's a value, not just in the educational setting, also in the healthcare, but there may already be a lot more guidance for healthcare interpreters than there is for educational interpreters or interpreters in education settings. And how this happens may be a little bit different depending on the educational setting. And of course, it's going to be different from your traditional or your more real healthcare settings. Of course, language access in schools is going to vary from state to state. So making sure that each state has their own policies is something that is also needed. Being in the Research, Education, and Policy Committee, I felt a lot of value in that. And I think there's a lot that we can do in terms of investigating what's going on in our local, regional, and state level in terms of language access in schools, and really look to support some of the policy changes that we feel are most appropriate, and to speak up against some of those that don't. I think I have mentioned most of the key points. We will have all of these notes available to the board to see if there's any further steps in terms of additional resources or tools that we can put out there. And again, something that's initiated this entire discussion was the fact that interpreting in education has been at the forefront. Many of us who are healthcare interpreters also interpret in education. So we really see that there's a crossroads. We see a lot of movement in education, and we want to make sure that the council has information from the members to know whether or not there's something that we need to be doing in this regard. Thank you all. And I'm wondering, do we have any time for additional people to kind of share a couple of comments?